Evaluator webinar training series. In this section, we'll be looking at evaluation of criteria in step 4 and the evaluation matrix or grid in step 5. Step 4, much like the underlying problem, is initially looked at for the structure and the standards that students develop to measure how their solutions accomplish the goals established in their underlying problem. So the first element is correctly written, that structure issue. And then we look at the relevance. How well does it apply to the underlying problem that their solutions are responding to? And then, of course, as always, we provide feedback to students to recognize their strengths and also areas for improvement. Now, the structure of a criteria, it's only 1 point for each of the 5 criteria, so they're independent from each other. The relevance, or rather the specificity of each criterion's content to the underlying problem, is eligible for up to 3 points per criterion. Now, to be considered correctly written, we're going to be looking at 4 different aspects. Is it singular in nature? And so is it measuring just a single object? It's not looking to see if it's most cost-effective and most quickly implemented, but only one of those things. Given the example I just mentioned, it's not a surprise that the second area is that it's using a superlative. Since these are used to rank solutions in the grid, they need to be in the superlative because it's not a raw score, but rather how they compare to one another. Are they written in a desirable direction? It seems very intuitive that that's what we would be looking for, but all of them need to be presented in the same manner so that the scoring applies. If you were looking for the least cost-effective on one solution and the best use of resources in the other, then it would not align, because what would be the best at one would actually in fact be the worst in the other respect. And then last of all is that they're a question. They need to be written as a question. And this is not for the sake of scoring students' grammar, but rather that their thinking is framed in an appropriate way, that they're looking at which solution is going to accomplish something. So once correctly written is established, this is where it is different from, say, step 1 or step 3. Even if a criterion is not considered to be correctly written, so if it does not use a superlative, or if it is not in a question form, you still examine it for relevance. Obviously, errors in correctly written could impact the relevance of it, but just because it is not correctly written does not mean that you completely stop scoring that individual criterion. So you would next look at them for sake of relevance, which a relevant criterion is one that is appropriate for evaluating solutions for this underlying problem. And it's important to keep that in mind, that each of these need to be applicable to the underlying problem. If we're examining things on the moon in terms of mining or resources, and they're asking which solution would be most effective for the animals in Honduran rainforest, there's a definite disconnect. It may be a valuable measuring tool, but not for the situation that they're faced with. And so in terms of earning points for relevance, there are 3 different types to be considered. With 1 point, for 1 point earned for generic criteria, those that are applicable to many different booklets or underlying problems. Modified, where they've made a connection, they've built upon that generic concept and tied it more directly to this particular future scene or underlying problem. And then there's advanced. The other options for scoring relevance is that it is not relevant, which we just considered, or the idea that it's a duplicate. So if one is which will cost the least and another one is which is most cost effective, it's very likely that those would be scored, that the second one would be scored as a duplicate, because they're both considering the same issue of financial feasibility. Okay, so for generic criteria, it's a criteria based on a generic concept that could be applied to very nearly any situation. Most often it addresses cost, speed, accessibility, and it lacks additional information. One common coaching technique, especially for new teams, is to remember the mnemonic device CARTS or charts, where it's cost and humaneness and acceptance, resources, time, and all of these realistically apply to just about any situation in real life today or in future situations. And it doesn't mean they aren't valuable concepts, because they certainly have a significant impact on how well things can be implemented and which ones would be feasible. But simply written in the form of which solution will cost the least, they have not brought anything new or insightful from the future scene to frame that. And so they would simply earn 1 point for relevance. Now, for modified criteria, these are ones that are based on that generic concept, yet they add additional information from the future scene. And so it might be that they consider a stakeholder. It might be which solution is the least expensive for the residents of an area, or a business that is part of the future scene, something that connects it into the future scene much more so than simply which one costs the least. It might have to do with future scene situational details, and it's also possible that they bring something to their criteria from their research they've conducted, key players or issues that have been highlighted in research as being pertinent to that topic. And so if it's a generic concept but has additional information strengthening its tie to the future scene, it would be considered modified. Are there any questions so far?
So far, no. My big question is going to be what the difference between modified and advanced is.
And that's where we go several different directions. So I want to make sure we're at least clear here before we move into the various options for advanced criteria. And do make a note that just as in solutions, adding future scene parameters does not make it a modified, just as it would not make it an elaborated in a solution, because that's information, that's the reality, the situation in which they need to be working within for any of these concepts. Okay, so for advanced criteria, these are ones that are firmly rooted in the future scene or the underlying problem. They have unique aspects of the topic incorporated in them. And there's several different ways that they can accomplish this. Now, we're going to start actually at the bottom of the slide. We say justified generic, because we've talked about generic as just a generic, and then a modified, which was built on a generic concept. So the way that they could take that generic concept and earn 3 points as a justified criteria is when they take a justification from the future scene. If they're told that, that a rocket is going to be landing in 7 days' time, and therefore their charge is to come up with an action plan to be presented when those people arrive. If they take that concept and say, in the future scene, there's only a week before these stakeholders are facing a critical situation, therefore, which solution will be the most expeditious, or something of that nature. They've taken that generic concept of time, but have justified it with information from the future scene, why it is so important in this situation. Does that make sense, Jill?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Okay, so then we'll look at the 2 other ways that they could earn those 3 points for an advanced criteria. Now, that first one on the slide is UP based, and this is where they typically will take an aspect of their key verb phrase or purpose It could potentially be an element from the condition phrase, though that is less common. But so if they ask in their key verb phrase, how might we improve access to healthcare? And then they turn around and develop a criteria that says which solution best improves access to healthcare. They are specifically using the core concept of their key verb phrase to score the solutions against each other. And so solution ideas that do not respond as firmly to their underlying problem would not rank as high. And so it's not something that could be enacted as a criterion in anyone else's booklet.
Okay.
Any question on that idea?
That makes sense, because if everything focuses on the key verb phrase, then your criteria, you would definitely want to have at least one criteria that focuses on your key verb phrase. Am I correct?
Right. And it's very common in coaching strategies, and so it's prevalent in books that we see where they might have two advanced criteria, one that's developed from their key verb phrase and one that's developed from their purpose. Because as a teaching strategy, that's a very explicit way to get the students to understand how to earn those additional points. But at the same time, it's very effective, because if we say in step 2 that our goals are to do X for reason Y, and then we turn around in criteria to score those solutions and say which one best accomplished X, which one helps us get the closest to Y. That's what we wanted to do in the first place. So it makes good sense to score those solutions with those ideas in place. And then the third option for advanced criteria is we call specific. And that's where it takes ideas from the research that are unique to the future scene, that it really could only apply to this topic. These are less frequently identified, but they do occur. Most of the time it's where there is a very specific issue that, trying to think of an example off the top of my head, and they're difficult because we don't see them so often. But it's the idea of if it's about blood donation, there's certain aspects to, which solution will best screen bloods for potential contaminants that realistically would never occur in any other topic. That's something that, having researched that issue, students would know and bring to the table. And so that's the type of thing that can come into play with those specific ones. One thing to note is that in the evaluation notes for each future scene, there are sample criteria. So some generic, some of those modified, and also several examples of justified, specific, and UP based, because criteria on the surface can be very simple looking, but when you actually go to analyze it, it can become much more difficult. Even though they're very short statements, they really pack a lot of punch in terms of what they're doing. So any questions on those?
I think that will be something that practice will make perfect on.
Practice is definitely a key for this one. It's really just becoming familiar and having those examples in the evaluation notes and reviewing them. It's quite common that in evaluator training sessions, or even just those evaluator meetings, whereas you review the UPs with your group of evaluators and have them look at the rubric, it's also normally a good idea to sit down and just do a quick refresher on criteria each time. Whereas challenges, once an evaluator becomes comfortable evaluating challenges and understanding those concepts, it's always good to have a refresher, but it's less frequently needed. Whereas with step 4, until it really becomes comfortable for an evaluator, there's a lot more referencing the guidelines or samples. So don't be discouraged. when you get to a criterion and you go, I'm just not sure, do pull out those evaluation guidelines, call your evaluation coordinator, look at examples. You're not the only one. It's very common for someone to pull out a reference sheet when looking at criteria. And let's see here. So just to review, first, each criterion is looked at in terms of, is it correctly written? Does it meet those 4 points of structure? Singular, desirable direction, written as a question, and is it in a superlative form? Then we look at it for relevance to the UP, which first of all, if it's not relevant to the underlying problem, we don't consider the concept that they're evaluating. And then third, being prepared to give that feedback, which, were they all generic? What's a way they could improve? Great job identifying 5 concepts. Have you considered including stakeholders from the future scene to move them to a modified? Or have you considered looking at the goals in your underlying problem to develop some advanced criterion? Some common ways to give feedback on step 4. Any other questions before we move on to step 5?
Yeah, I think we're ready for step 5.
Very good. Okay, so now that we've established 5, hopefully all 5 criterion in step 4, we're going to look at how to apply them in the evaluation matrix, which the matrix is set up so that you can use those criterion to determine your best solution, which will then be developed into an action plan. And seemingly simple and only worth 5 points, but a surprising number of errors occur here. First of all, each column in the booklet, they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the grid, corresponds to the criterion that's at the top of the page. So criterion 1 was cost. In the column labeled 1, the students ranked them 1 through 8, or perhaps 1 through 5 as an individual would be, but also on a team book, if they only completed 6 solutions, then they obviously would only have 6 solutions to rank, and using 1 through 6 would be appropriate. They would not be penalized for having less than 8 if they did not genuinely have 8 solutions presented in the booklet. But so it's the idea of ranking them, and you can only rank 1 through 8, 8 being high, best, 1 being poorest, and one number per column. Then adding the scores for each solution idea across those 5 criterion, which is the highest scoring solution. And whatever that high scoring solution is, must be used as the basis for their action plan. And so those 5 points have considerable implications for developing that action plan. First of all, math errors. You're going to deduct 1 point for each error that occurs. Now, if they, let's say in a column, they used the number 3 twice, you penalize them for using it twice in that column, but you don't penalize them for the math at the end as long as they added the numbers correctly. Once you've deducted that point, you don't penalize them a second time for something resulting from that same issue. Now here's a concern, obvious grid manipulation. And this is where we're talking about, they have ranked their solutions that the best solution got 8s on all 5 criteria, and then the next one got 7s on all 5 criteria, and 6, and so on, because that manipulation indicates that they did not use the tools which are designed to help them with their thinking process and the analysis of their solution ideas. If they simply just put numbers on the piece of paper to complete the task, they've missed the point of it, and they haven't used the thinking process that's critical at this stage. And so that grid, even if all the math is correct, and even if the best solution is used, they would only receive 1 point. And then also, if whatever that best solution is based on the scores needs to be the basis for their action plan. Now, if they had an addition error and what they identified as their best solution was in fact the second best solution because of a math error, we wouldn't penalize them for that, because based on their math, their determination, they did in fact use what they believed to be the best solution. However, if they just decided that another solution was perhaps more interesting, more creative, they thought would make a better skit, whatever their thought process may be on that front, if they don't use the one with the highest number of points in step 6, then they would be awarded only 1 point here. It's also good to know that on the grid, if there is a tie, if 2 solutions come in at the same high score, the team should only use one of those 2 solutions as the foundation for their action plan. It's great and it demonstrates their creativity if they explain how they broke the tie, but it is not required to have that explanation. But the key is that in step 6, they only use one as the foundation and overarching plan of attack for their action plan.
Do they need to go back and adjust the grid if they have a tie?
No, they do not need to. They certainly can if they realize that things aren't proceeding in the manner that they expected, but that should be a key to them that maybe the solution that we are most interested in working on is not actually the best solution, because those are in fact often 2 different things. And so if they do have a tie, there's no need to break the tie formally or to change numbers, because in the thought process, it's better to recognize that these 2, are equally good as far as the criteria we've developed. And it often, we hear from coaches that whereas on a practice problem, they might have 2 tie, that when they come to look at things in the competitive round, they've realized that maybe the issue was that their criteria were not as effective as they had originally believed, and they focus in on developing more effective criteria, especially as they move out of all generic criteria, as a beginner team might often show, into those advanced criteria that do account for which one is directly focused on the goals of the underlying problem and that type of thing. Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up steps 4 and 5. So are there any questions before we conclude?
No, I think we've got it.
All right, thanks, and we'll see you guys next time.